Now, I know what you're thinking to start with. Why is this American talking to us about Europe? But just bear with me, because everybody has a story, and you just don't know what mine is yet. Now, slides. First of all, I'm originally from California, where we have earthquakes. And I titled my presentation this year, Seismic Change. And your corporate affairs people asked me to come and talk about the last 20 years and the next 20 years for Europe in under 30 minutes. Because for some reason, they kept telling me they have lots of exciting things planned for you today, and I don't know why, but I guess they thought geopolitics was not exciting. But we're going to try to change that. Now, I always start with this quote. It isn't special for this audience. I told you that I also had a European story, and mine includes having spent a couple of years living in Russia during the Wild West days and doing my postgraduate degree in post-Soviet studies. And when everything started really kind of spinning earlier this year, I thought of this famous quote from Vladimir Lenin, because it has felt like the world is turning very fast. But just for perspective, when Lenin said this, it was in the aftermath of the Bolshevik Revolution, the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, and the onset of World War I. So I hope we can agree that we're not really dealing with this level of chaos at all. But it does feel like the world is changing fast. So we're not going to do this quantitatively, but by a show of hands, a bit of a vibe monitor, how many people think the world is better now than it's ever been? Raise your hands. I am paying attention. I will be staying later. Your boss has raised his hand. I won't tell you which way. How many people feel like the world is worse than ever? And we will come back to this. Don't be afraid. I know that's fine. We'll come back to this at the end, and we'll talk a little bit about why. I ask this question everywhere I go, in every market, developed markets, emerging markets, and it is really fascinating how people answer. I'm going to come back to that. Now, a little bit in the past here. The period between 1989, when the wall came down, and 2007 was the most peaceful and prosperous period actually in all of human history. As someone who was in high school and university during the first part of this period, I would also argue we had the best music. By far. And it's not even close. But keep that in mind for a minute, because our generational experience of change has a lot to do with our risk perception and our risk appetite. And as I say, I travel all around the world talking to boards and C-suites of financial institutions and corporates. And this has been something very interesting. I'm actually writing a book about this. So while we are talking about the last 20 years, you know, the good old days, let us remind ourselves of just how much happened during this period, right? The global financial crisis. I was a managing director at a global investment bank when that was taking place, and that was really something to behold. The Eurozone crisis, which we all experienced here, the Arab Spring, the pandemic, Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, and what I am diplomatically calling the US reset. I told you I have to deal with a lot of corporate affairs and legal and compliance. I had a US tech company that wouldn't let me put US policy on a slide, even. But that's another story. So these last 2 points have really been what has kicked into gear the interest in geopolitics. But a lot of you might look at that list and say, well, these are all black swan events. And I would push back on that. And this all has to do with my kind of theory about sort of behavioral geopolitics. I was at Davos every year when the epidemiologists would come along and give their presentations about the risk of a global pandemic. And you know what? Nobody wanted to go to those presentations because they thought they were boring and depressing. So it wasn't that the COVID-19 pandemic was a black swan that no one had thought of. It was that our biases prevented most of us from giving much time to thinking about it. So in other words, most of the big, whether crises or just kind of event risks that take place, that happen, very rarely are they complete surprises. In fact, I would say that none of these were. So we're getting closer to the present, and I mentioned that the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022 and then the US reset are what really has put geopolitics front and center for corporate strategy as well as for financial markets, which is where I spent most of my time. 600% increase in the use of the term. Now, some of this might be CEOs blaming geopolitics from poor results. We wouldn't want to name names. But it clearly has skyrocketed to the top 3. Everybody is talking about geopolitics. The trouble is, nobody really knows what it means. One thing I would like to correct is the impression that many of us have that geopolitics is news, that it's news flow. There's lots of news. I have to keep up with the news. Well, if reading the news is depressing, then I have some good news for you, because reading more news is not going to improve what we call your PQ, your political quotient. The first and most important thing to understand about geopolitics is that it is about power. That was very dramatic, thank you. Glass breaking. Geopolitics describes what nations do to project power over their borders. That can be war, with tanks and bombs and missiles. It can be propaganda. It can be misinformation and disinformation. There are many ways of doing this, but we are now in an era where geopolitics has become primary, and this is confusing for all of us who grew up in a world of peace, stability, and getting an MBA, where it was all about the commercial imperative. For leaders, power first, money comes after. For business, money first, power comes after. And that failure to not appreciate that inversion has a lot to do with why we keep misinterpreting geopolitics in the business world. Now, as you heard from the intro, I am a person with a mission. And my mission is not just to scare people about geopolitics, but to empower all of us to get to grips with what this new era really means. And I've been at this for 25 years. My firm has partnered with quantitative political scientists at Columbia University to create an evidence base for tracking geopolitical risks. We published the first lot of data looking at 15 years, and we're about to do the first quarterly update, because I realized sitting in boardrooms that whenever I would present, there would be an argument. This isn't real, it's just news flow, that term again, mean reversion, it's going to go back to normal. This is what our evidence found. In the period between 2010, second half of the global financial crisis, to the end of 2024, so even before Donald Trump returned to the White House, we saw this, a tripling of global risk events tracked across these areas. Cyber attacks, trade disputes, again, even before Liberation Day, 10-fold increase. Civil unrest, conflict, also climate events. If you were looking for proof, this is it. We're now going to monitor it on a quarterly basis, but we are not going back to normal, whatever normal was, because as I showed you, in the past 20 years that we look back on somewhat nostalgically, we actually went through a great deal of disruption. This nostalgia bias is comforting, but it's a little bit like the children in Goodbye Lenin after their mother falls into the coma and they bring her the pickles from the GDR that they thought she missed. This is just nostalgia. The pickles may or may not have been better, but we're not going back. So how do we shift? The room has gone cold. How do we shift to competitive advantage? Because this is crucial if we're going to succeed. We have to think differently about shock events, because there is a first order implication. Just to take, for example, the recent announcement from the White House about H-1B visas. You know, immediate analyst reports talking about Indian companies and who's going to be impacted. Well, hello Europe, this is very good for us. We can attract more talent if we adapt. We have to do more of this and more quickly. In our work, we're very focused on the so-called unintended consequences. That's the stuff that happens that they didn't mean to happen. You've got to be really attuned to this and not be paralyzed by change. And I say this because after Liberation Day, I would say it started to change just a couple of weeks ago after the summer holidays. An awful lot of our clients were paralyzed. So, having started my career on the trading floor and lived to tell the tale, spent a lot of time talking to institutional investors. One of the questions that I get most often is, how are we sure that any of this matters because markets are outperforming, right? Where's the signal? Where's the tipping point? I have been on the record for a long time, and I feel even more strongly about it now, saying that by the time we get a signal, in other words, where a risk becomes systemic and impacts asset prices or the growth outlook, it's actually too late. It's going to be too late. So if a development doesn't generate a signal, that doesn't mean you can ignore it. Instead, we need to think much more analytically about data points that might become trend lines. It isn't going to work anymore to try to say signal versus noise, ignore everything else. Not if you want to seek opportunity. So again, moving forward, one of the things that none of us have really had to think about very much is what political scientists like me call the international system, right? The balance of power. We grew up professionally in the post-Cold War sole superpower moment. We then got a little bit closer to what Jacques Chirac called a multipolar moment. Now it's actually a lot less clear. Why? It's geopolitics again. There's a lot of emphasis to gain geopolitical market share, to set the rules of the game. We're in the midst of this competition right now. The easiest thing for us all to agree is probably global fragmentation, but Xi Jinping isn't just kind of making do with fragmentation. Of course, he wants to turn it to his advantage, and so do a lot of other actors. After the Shanghai Cooperation Organization meetings at the beginning of September, was that only 2.5 weeks ago, lots of talk about a China-led world order. You know, all the tanks and the parades. I actually don't buy it. We have to pay attention, but it is far too early to say that. And there is a great instinct, I think, of people in our world to pronounce the next big thing. If you are at all a student of history, you know that this is all nonlinear. And that's probably the most important thing I can tell you, the non-linearity. We are, however, moving toward temporary alliances, very temporary. US and India have spent 20 years building a diplomatic relationship that got blown up when President Trump passed the 500% tariffs. Then he tried to wish Modi a happy birthday and say he didn't mean it. It's hard to know who our friends are and who are just, marriages of convenience. Soft authoritarianism is also something to watch that alarms us in Europe. But we've got to think in a more nuanced way. A little bit here more kind of down to nuts and bolts. How do we make the most of this moment in Europe? It's something I'm asked about a lot. Certainly, Europe policy experts tend to be quite negative, but I think that it may just be that President Trump and Vladimir Putin have done us in Europe a big favor by shaking us up out of our sleep. I do think we have gotten very comfortable. It has been very nice. Time to focus. So our superpowers, our political stability, in relative terms, obviously, can be our Achilles heels at the same time. Every quality, of course, has a positive side, or at an extreme, can undermine us. Of these, risk aversion, to me, is the thing that we have to get over fast. We cannot wait until the signal comes, because the opportunity will be gone. We have an amazing quality of life, but we cannot become welfare states attached to countries. We have to change our mindset, and also not forget that the most effective mechanism in the history of humanity has been European Union membership. And you only have to look at the difference in the quality of life between Poland, Romania, etc., and the countries on the other side. Oh, and I mentioned my European story. My family came from Portugal in the 1950s during the fascist dictatorship. So let us not have short memories. Now, if you look carefully, I think you see a Vermeer in the background. Sorry about that. What are we going to be in 2045? What do we want to be? This doesn't happen in some sort of preordained fashion. We get to contribute to what happens through our own actions. This is what business strategy means, but also we are parents, we are citizens, we are aunts and uncles. We can take initiative. I think we forgot how, to be honest. You have to want to participate in the world you want to live in. It's a lot easier to complain, but it's really disempowering. It's really disempowering to complain. Much more fun to shape outcomes. So what do we want to be? I use this expression, by the way, because in my previous life, I worked for Bob Rubin, the former US Treasury Secretary. He actually used to call me and say, Tina, tell me what's happening in the museum economies of Europe. Right? You know, and that was some time ago. But that's how we are regarded, a museum of culture and maybe even of values. How can we keep the things that we like while rising to the moment? Now, I know that this can be an uncomfortable topic, but I also am an advisor to the UK Ministry of Defence and a serving UK Army officer. You can call me Major Fordham if you like. And one of the things that we talk about is the rearmament trade in Europe. This is really important. I actually believe quite strongly that it is our best and most important hope. I mentioned I come from Silicon Valley, where its early history in defense is what led to the tech industry that we have today. It also means we're going to have to think about some social resilience challenges like conscription. This is on the horizon. We are in a serious and grave moment, but we are not without many options, and I want to make that very clear. I think we're going to see more national champions again. Obviously, one of them being UniCredit. A European Belt and Road, why not? And I do think that we already saw this in the aftermath of the Russian invasion, that European identity was strengthened. There is nothing like a common adversary to remind people of what they have in common. So how do we get to the more positive future that I've outlined? Does everybody remember this? This is Jean-Claude Juncker. It's one of my favorite ever quotes from a politician. And I mean, I think it was said quite mournfully. We just don't know how to get elected. You know, we laugh, but look what happened in America, where a lot of people seem to have voted for Donald Trump because they thought he would bring down, you know, the cost of living, groceries and gasoline, and that didn't happen. Our politicians feel like they can't do the right thing, and they have populists nipping at their heels. A little bit on the business side, you are bankers, you need to do business. This is the bulk of the advisory work that we do, talking about these things. I think we see more conglomerate discounts, Kraft Heinz, etc. We call MAD, mergers, acquisitions, disposals, and disputes. I am actually more optimistic than a lot of people I know about capital markets integration. We've got a couple of very smart Italians. In addition to Andrea, of course, we have Draghi, we have Enrico Letta. They've given us the blueprint. We need to find some urgency, because this is what's going to happen. And on number 6, again, one sort of consequence of Trump in the White House has been a surprisingly overt signaling of reduced regulatory enforcement. This is an opportunity too. So, tired and wired, DCF. Does everybody know what that is? Discounted cash flow. That's how we think about risk and how we track it. Mean reversion, everything will go back to the way it has been. Base case and tail risk is another formula that I advise against. The old formula was 10% tail risk, 90% base case. No, you have to stress test plausible probability events. 20% probability events happen in real life every day. Look at a wider range and stress test them. This is just essential. Focus on operational risk. Again, I talk to a lot of boards. They really only want to hear about it when it's coming through the front door. This is too late too. Geopolitics isn't like the weather, and it's not like a force of nature. I made the point about black swans for this reason. Almost everything that eventually comes up to hit us in the face has been at the back of the Financial Times or Handelsblatt before it comes to the front. But we didn't look at it. We can change the way that we do that too. What do we do instead? We should assume that the US is going to be in flux indefinitely. I noticed, and I can say this amongst friends, I'm sure, that when there was this health scare for President Trump, I had a lot of Europeans coming to me saying, well, I mean, if he dies, then, it's over, right? No, first of all, there's a constitution, and J.D. Vance takes over and he stays in place in the event that the president's no longer able to serve until the next election in 2028. And also, there will be Trumpism after Trump. Don't assume, as the US Democrats do, that poor economic performance in America will translate into Democrats winning in the midterms. This is very far from evident, because Donald Trump is unpopular, but guess who is more unpopular? Democrats. They are underwater. Incumbent wins unless there's a better offer. And right now, Democrats' best offer is Gavin Newsom from my home state of California and his trolling, which is pretty good if you watch it. As I say, I wasn't asked to come here and go into detail, but rather to do the 20 years before and 20 years after. I will tell you what we are following. We are in the midst of a global power vacuum. The Pentagon has written a memo that doesn't mention Europe, that doesn't mention Taiwan, Japan, or any traditional US security allies. It focuses on the homeland, and I guess Venezuela, the hemisphere. We're on our own, people. It's really way past time to take that seriously. The Commission was talking about a Trump-proof Europe 5 years ago, and here we are. US executive authority and overreach, this will be fought through the courts. Mainly, don't expect big demonstrations in the streets of America. I wouldn't expect it. Do expect the war in Israel, the war between Israel and Hamas, and the Russia-Ukraine war to continue to fracture countries in the way they work. We're going to see this next week at the UN General Assembly. The Russians are coming after us with gray zone attacks. If you don't believe it, and somehow you don't believe me, I encourage you to look at the report just published by the IISS, the International Institute for Security Studies, just published 2 weeks ago, which tracks Russian gray zone attacks in Europe. Last point. Next year, I am sorry to be US-centric, because I am an adopted European. But the midterms in November and the United States quincentennial, the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, is unfortunately going to dominate what happens there, how the president decides to move policy forward, and again, how other countries and companies act, because we have agency. We do not have to wait to passively be rule takers and wait for opportunities abandoned by others. I'm going to end with a French quote, which I hope nobody minds. I really like my Goethe, but I couldn't think of one that would fit here. Fortune favors the brave, but chance favors the prepared mind. If you avoid thinking about global politics because it's depressing or boring, I'm sorry you feel that way, it hurts my feelings a little bit, but you won't have your mind prepared because everything will come as a surprise to you.
So you said we are on our own, and there was a glimpse of Europe in 2045. How do we get there, and what do we need to do to get there?
The first thing is to be brave. Why does everyone look scared when I say that? We have to be brave. We have to move to take advantage of this opportunity. That means we've got to challenge all of those things I mentioned that we learned in business school. You know, there's an expression that says, what got you here won't get you there. Mm-hmm. You know, if you are a middle-aged person like myself, like many others I can see in the audience, you've done pretty well. If you want to keep going, you will have to adapt. We are in a different place, and we're not going back. I mean, in my view, we were never going back. But that's the way that we start to change the mindset.
Just out of my curiosity, the question whether the world is better or worse than it has ever been, what is your opinion and why?
This question, I mentioned I use it wherever I go. It's actually inspired by the work of Dr. Hans Rosling. If you have read the book Factfulness, if you haven't, you must read it. His work was taken over after his death just a few years ago by his son and daughter-in-law, and they've got an online kind of resource called the Worldview Updater. All of you have to write speeches. This is your new friend, because what it does is provides exactly these kinds of indicators. So by just about any metric, the world is better now than it has ever been in all of the history of humanity, right? I see the doubters in the audience, but you feel like it's worse. And this is important. You feel like it's worse. Not just worse now than 10 years ago. I asked ever. You think it's worse now than it's ever been. I can't prove this, but in my opinion, I think part of the reason why we feel that the world is spinning out of control is technology. I think digitization makes banks a lot of money, but it makes people miserable. Having to deal with, you know, all of these, you know, it's impossible to get anything done, the sludge and all of this sort of thing. But if we reset our perspective, I think we can find that we are incredibly lucky to be where we are. And if we don't like the way things are going, change it.